I thought our anniversary would be my happiest day. Then I heard one secret that broke my heart and shattered my family forever. I am Olathe Winterhawk. I work as a wildlife photographer, spending my days tracking movement through lenses and waiting for the right moment to capture beauty in the wild. I always believed family came first, until my own sister betrayed me. The restaurant was dim, lit by the warm glow of amber candles that flickered against the mahogany walls. I adjusted my silk scarf, feeling the weight of the silver anniversary band on my finger. Mark, my husband, sat across from me, his eyes bright with a kind of adoration that had sustained us for 5 years. My sister, Clara, sat beside me, her laughter ringing out a little too loudly, a little too frequently. She looked beautiful in her emerald dress, but there was a tightness in her jaw that caught my attention. Every time I reached for my water glass, she seemed to stiffen, her eyes darting toward Mark with a frequency that felt less like sibling observation and more like a nervous tick. I brushed it off, blaming it on my own heightened sense of awareness. I was a professional observer, after all. My job was to notice the twitch of an ear or the shift in a predator's posture. But as the evening progressed, the air between them became thick with a strange, unspoken static. Then, as I stepped away to the ladies' room, I heard it. I paused just outside the corner of the hallway as Clara leaned toward Mark. "She doesn't suspect a thing," she whispered, her voice sharp with a frantic, triumphant edge. "She is so busy looking through her camera lens that she's blind to what's happening in her own chair." My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, aching rhythm that threatened to choke me. I didn't say a word. I smoothed my skirt, fixed my expression into a mask of polite indifference, and walked back to the table, but the warmth of the evening had vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. The ride home was quiet, filled only with the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the crushing weight of my own thoughts. I looked back at the last few months. There were moments I had buried under the guise of normalcy, the way Clara was always at our house when I was on location, the sudden changes in our household budget that Mark dismissed as rising inflation, the cryptic text messages that vanished from his screen the second I entered the room. I had been so focused on capturing the migration patterns of elk in the valley that I had completely missed the migration of my own husband's heart. I sat in the dark of our bedroom that night, watching the moonlight crawl across the floorboards. I began to track Clara's movements in my mind like I would track a wounded animal. Why was she always here? Why did she have a key to our private office? I started to catalog the inconsistencies. There was the time she insisted on helping me organize my digital archives, only to delete a folder of joint tax documents. There was the way she would wear perfume that Mark had specifically bought for me, laughing it off as a gift exchange between sisters. I realized with a sickening lurch that I had been living in a house built on shifting sand. My family, the bedrock of my existence, felt suddenly fragile, like an old structure beginning to buckle under the weight of unseen decay. I wondered if I was the only one who didn't know, or if the entire world had been watching me play the fool while I was busy documenting the world outside my window. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. Mark was at a conference, and I was home editing photos. I opened his laptop, needing to clear space for a batch of high-resolution images, when a notification pinged in the corner of the screen. It was a message from a shared cloud account that synced to his device. It was a folder labeled Private Documents, but when I clicked it, it opened into a series of screenshots of bank transfers and legal correspondence. My hands trembled. These weren't tax documents. They were legal filings for a property purchase in another state, bought in Clara's name but funded entirely from our joint savings. There were messages, too. They were cold, transactional, and filled with a casual cruelty that made bile rise in my throat. Clara was detailing how she had successfully diverted my inheritance funds, calling me the oblivious artist who wouldn't notice a missing zero. The betrayal was so vast that it felt impossible to contain. It wasn't just an affair of the heart. It was a systematic dismantling of my security, my future, and my identity. I felt a cold, jagged anger take root in my chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a war. I closed the laptop, my breath hitching, and looked around the room. Everything I saw, the books on the shelves, the paintings on the wall, the very house I stood in, suddenly felt like a stage set in a play I hadn't realized I was starring in. I couldn't scream. I couldn't call a lawyer yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and forced myself to be still, to breathe, to understand that if I spoke now, I would lose the chance to see the full scope of the trap they had set for me. The next few days were a blur of calculated performances. I kept my face neutral, my voice steady. I watched Clara walk into my kitchen with that familiar, predatory smile, offering to help with dinner, and I felt nothing but a frozen, analytical distance. I asked her about the property market, about her finances, watching her pupils dilate as she spun web after web of lies. She lied with such ease that it was almost impressive. She told me she was looking for a small apartment for herself, that she wanted to be closer to us, while I knew she had already secured the deed to a house I had dreamed of buying for our future family. I watched her lie directly to my face, her eyes never flickering, and I felt the last vestiges of my childhood trust dissolve into dust. It was no longer about them. It was about me. I began to understand that my sister was driven by a deep, hollow jealousy that had been festering for years. She didn't just want what I had. She wanted to erase the fact that I had ever had it to begin with. She wanted to stand where I stood and look at the world through eyes that weren't mine. I knew then that I could never go back to being the sister who shared her secrets. I had to become the woman who protected her own life. I spent my nights in the dark, my mind churning with the realization of her motive. It was the inheritance, yes, but it was deeper. It was the feeling of superiority she craved. She had felt overshadowed by my career, by my marriage, and by the love I had cultivated in my life. She wanted to prove she could take it all and leave me with nothing. The anger that had burned so brightly was cooling into something harder, sharper, and more enduring. I would not be a victim. I would be a witness to my own liberation. I started to map out the evidence, noting dates, times, and amounts. I realized I had been treating my life like a gallery, but it was really a landscape, and the terrain had shifted. I needed to adapt. I would never let another person dictate the terms of my reality again. I moved with the precision of a hunter. I kept my routine, I continued my work, but behind the scenes, I was a ghost. I spent hours scrubbing through digital logs and financial statements. I hid my notes in plain sight, disguised as photography drafts. I stopped trusting the apologies Clara offered whenever I seemed distant. I let her think I was just stressed, just tired from the workload. She started to grow bolder, thinking her manipulation had rendered me completely pacified. She even started leaving little clues, a receipt here, a calendar reminder there, as if she wanted to be caught, as if the thrill of the lie was the only thing that made her feel alive. I waited. I did not rush. A good photograph isn't about snapping quickly, it's about waiting for the subject to reveal its true nature. The final piece of the puzzle appeared in a bank statement I had intercepted. It wasn't just money, it was a forged power of attorney, drafted and signed months ago. My father's signature had been mimicked, and the document had been used to transfer my family's trust into an account controlled by Clara. I realized with horror that this went further than I imagined. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had misled our parents, convincing them I was in financial distress and needed the funds moved for my own protection. They thought they were helping me, but they were actually funding the destruction of my life. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I knew I had to tell them, but I needed the full narrative, the complete, unalterable proof that would leave no room for her to maneuver. I spent the next 3 days gathering the evidence. I created a digital dossier, a timeline of every lie, every transfer, and every forgery. I went to an old friend, a forensic accountant, who helped me structure the financial data into a narrative that even a child could understand. I organized every receipt, every email, and every recorded conversation into a folder that felt heavier than lead. It was all there. I wasn't just going to expose a secret, I was going to dismantle the entire foundation of her deception. I was ready. I invited our parents and Mark to a Sunday dinner, under the pretense of a family celebration. The house was quiet, the air thick with an anticipation that made my skin prickle. When the time came, I didn't shout. I stood in the center of the living room, the folder resting on the table like an indictment. I looked at Clara, who was sipping wine and laughing at a joke Mark had made. I opened the folder. One by one, I laid out the documents. I didn't need to speak much. The paper did the work for me. The forgery, the bank transfers, the emails, they painted a picture so stark that the room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Clara's face drained of color, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. I looked at my father, whose face was a mask of grief as he scanned the fraudulent documents. There was no room for her to hide, no lie left to tell. The truth hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. The consequences were swift and absolute. Within a week, the legal proceedings had stripped Clara of her assets and her standing. She was fired from her position, her reputation in our social circle obliterated by the sheer scale of her betrayal. She lost the trust of everyone who had once loved her. My father, his voice thick with heartbreak, sat her down in the living room and told her that she was no longer a part of our family, that he could not look at her without seeing the ruin she had wrought. He cut all ties, and as she left the house for the last time, her head bowed and her hands shaking, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. The house felt lighter, the shadows retreating from the corners. I went to my office, packed my cameras, and looked at the space where her things had once been. I was choosing myself now. I walked out of that house and into the crisp afternoon air, feeling the sun on my face and the weight of the past finally falling away. I turned the key in the lock, left it under the mat, and stepped toward a new life, the horizon wide, empty, and entirely mine. The path ahead was silent, clear, and finally free.